Greetings, writers. It's Mr. Hebda from the Lackawanna College Writing Center, here with the second part in our series on quotation marks. What's dialogue? Let's dive right in. So dialogue is a literary device. It's a technique that's used to express the speech or thoughts of a character, usually their exact words. And it's set off from the rest of the story with our friends, the quotation marks. They're these kind of like double curls that bracket off the words that are part of the dialogue. So a great way to think of this, with the help of our smiley face friend, is to think of quotation marks and dialogue as kind of like the literary equivalent of a speech bubble that you would find in a comic book. So dialogue is kind of like a speech bubble in that it contains the words that are spoken by a character. All right, let's talk a little bit about the difference between dialogue and narration. So dialogue, as we just mentioned, is the exact spoken words of a character, and sometimes it contains thoughts of the character too. Our example here is Sam cried, "I'm going to be late for class." And as you can see here, we got quotation marks. Somebody's saying something. But check it out with narration, right? Narration's the words of the narrator. It's what the narrator's saying. And the narrator says, Sam rushed into the classroom. There's no quotation marks here. Well, the narrator is just the voice of the storyteller. So in order to set off the voices of characters from the voice of the storyteller, we use those quotation marks to make that clear. And some stories tend to have more dialogue in them, and other ones tend to have more narration. But in all stories, dialogue is super important, and we're going to explain that a little bit later. First, let's break down dialogue. What's dialogue made of? Well, dialogue is made up of two different parts, usually. It's got the dialogue tag, which is like a tag on your shirt, which tells you where the shirt comes from. The dialogue tag tells you where the dialogue is coming from, who's the character speaking. And then, of course, dialogue is our exact spoken words of the character in quotation marks. So here's an example. Fatima said, "I wonder if we'll have a pop quiz." So Fatima's the one speaking here. She's part of the dialogue tag. And then she says, "I wonder if we'll have a pop quiz." So those are her words. That's the dialogue. It's in quotation marks. Now, sometimes in stories, if it's obvious who's speaking, a writer might drop the dialogue tag. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. So let's revisit that question. Why is dialogue so important? Why are we spending all this time talking about it? Well, I'm sure that your instructor has already mentioned that every word in a story is important. But dialogue is especially super important. And the fact that dialogue is put in quotation marks and it gets a paragraph of its own, so it's got extra white space around it, it really draws the reader's attention. It zooms you in. And that's because dialogue is a special platform where the writer can do a bunch of different things, including driving the plot forward, right? There's no small talk here. Every piece of dialogue in a story is going to push the story along. It's going to move the storyline forward. And dialogue also tells us information about characters. It can tell us how a character speaks, like a sense of their personality, maybe their background. It can also tell us a sense of their mood, their emotion, their feelings. So there's a lot going on here with character. And dialogue is also a really great platform or mouthpiece for an author to express literary elements. So it's a really, really great tool to zero in on if you're working on a literary analysis essay. So I want to wrap up by showing an example of how we can use a dialogue to help us in a literary analysis essay. So check out the quotation video for more information about general quotation rules. But here's a couple that we would use when we're going to quote dialogue. Use only the most important words. No need for big, like, whole sentences or paragraphs ripped from the story, unless those are super, super important evidence. Also, usually you're not going to need the dialogue tag, unless, again, it has important evidence in it. And as always, make sure you're using in-text citation. You don't want to get charged plagiarism. That's a no-no. So let me give you an example of use of dialogue in a literary analysis essay. So, in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the irony of Harry's link to the magical world appears when Mrs. Dursley remarks that Harry is a nasty common name. So, in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Mrs. Dursley does actually say on page 7 in dialogue, nasty common name, that phrase, when describing the name Harry. And this is important because it gives us one of the themes of the story, one of the important literary elements in the story, which is the contrast between something that's ordinary or common and something that's extraordinary or magical. And so irony is this kind of contrast, this unexpectedness, right? It's unexpected that Harry, who's ordinary, is actually magical. He's got an ordinary name, but he's a magical person. So this is a really great way to use dialogue to support your literary interpretations. But I want to point out a few more things before we wrap up about how we punctuate here. There's no comma before the quotation, and the period doesn't go inside the quotation marks, but at the end of the citation. So that's an example of what's called MLA, or Modern Language Association formatting, which is the most common type of formatting used in literary analysis essays. So if you have any questions about MLA formatting or dialogue or any other writing needs, be sure to make an appointment at the Writing Center. And as always, we also have videos available on the Lackawanna College Writing Center YouTube channel on lots of other helpful topics. So keep up all the great work, writers. Mr. Hebda out.